Here is some audio from a big game tag auction at the Western Hunting and Conservation Expo. 750. The auctioneer is giving us a play-by-play as bidders vie for the Arizona statewide mule deer tag, which will go on to sell for $725,000, an all-time record. Auction tags like this one raise millions of dollars for wildlife conservation. But recently, they've come under scrutiny, and in some places like Arizona, agencies are now looking for different options. Instead of auctions where only the wealthiest hunters can participate, states are considering big game tag raffles, where everyday hunters can buy a ticket for maybe $5 or $20 and have a chance to win one of these coveted tags. I'm Editor-in-Chief Alex Robinson, and today on the podcast, I'm talking to our hunting and conservation editor, Andrew McKean. He has been covering auction tags for years, and here, he'll share some details about the darker side of auctions, but also why, in many cases, we still need them. Andrew, to just start us out in this conversation, could you explain how auction tags for big game work?
Yeah. Though I think there's a more fundamental just thing to talk about first, and that is kind of why they exist in the first place. And I think it's we went for much of our modern history as North American hunters without these things, right? So why did they suddenly come into being? They came into being largely because they're designed to raise money for state wildlife agencies to manage wildlife species that are rare and special and really can't cover their own costs of management. So think about like mountain goats. We'll talk about bighorn sheep, I hope, later on. Moose, sorts of things. They don't sell enough tags to generate the revenue from, kind of millions of hunters to cover all the costs of management. And so it's just one tool that state agencies have used to add to that pot. So anyway, that's kind of the origin of them. They exist to raise that extra funding.
And what is it though?
Well, so what they are is the state allows one, sometimes more than one, but it's usually just a single sort of trophy opportunity to hunt a single species anywhere in the state. So it's like an uber super extra tag where you're not constrained by hunting districts. In some states, you're not even constrained by hunting seasons. You can hunt 365 days a year for this one species. So anywhere in the state, you can shoot the biggest or the smallest, whatever you want. It's sort of whatever the owner of that tag decides to do with it.
It's almost like a fantasy tag that you would make up with your buddies. Like, what would be cool is if I could just do this. It's kind of what it is.
So my buddies and I have we have kind of an inside joke about it. And one of my buddies is named Ed, and he is always pushing the boundary of things. We always claim that he's got the governor's tag. He's like, well, I'm going to just use my governor's tag on this. And it's a little like having the governor's tag. For the record, Ed has never actually exercised his inability to use the non-existent governor's tag, but it's just kind of a funny thing to think about.
Right. Okay. So there are these very coveted, very valuable tags that, sort of any big game hunter would love the opportunity to have. And then what happens? They just go up for auction and like the highest bidder gets them? How does that part work?
Yeah. So in the auction tag model, it's an auction. It is, it's put out for anybody to bid on. And like any other auction for real estate or, garage sale, if it's at an auction, it really requires two pretty enthusiastic bidders to raise the purchase price. And obviously it's in the state management or the state agency's interest to raise as much money as possible. And so what's interesting about these things is there's sort of an infrastructure around them to try to get as many enthusiastic bidders in the room at the same time as possible to bid the value of these things up, to raise the most amount of money for the resource.
And you're saying enthusiastic, but also wealthy, because like you and I are not going to be able to buy tags in these auctions, right?
Yeah, typically, I mean, some of these tags, we can kind of get into a little bit of like the accounting of it in a little bit, but some of these things are going for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's by design. Like that's the whole idea. It's like, let's raise as much money as possible. And so they're heavily advertised. The participants kind of know what they're buying. Like the trophy quality that they're interested in is there in the state. And so these are real spectacles. If you've ever been to the Western Hunting and Conservation Expo in Salt Lake City in February, that's like it's almost a gladiator ring of these sort of like auctions at the end of the dinners each night. The sheep show, which is put on by the Foundation for Wild Sheep, is similarly like it's a big sort of destination event for people who are going to bid on these auction tags.
Can you describe, just for folks who haven't been there, describe like what it's like to be in the room? Because you've been at these, right? Like, what is it like?
Oh yeah, it's great. It is high theater. I mean, you've got to start with an auction book that has really the nitty gritty details. It kind of says what the season dates are, what the species is, if there's any constraints in terms of hunting district or even, kind of weapons choice. And it'll also say, who's sponsoring the tag. So a lot of times the state agency actually gives these tags to a nonprofit organization to then broker the auction. And that's an important thing we can get into later, but there's a third party that actually does the brokering of these things. And so those are all detailed in the auction book, and everybody's got an auction book in their hand. And the lights dim, there's a spotlight, there's an auctioneer with a tuxedo, there's rock music. I mean, there is a build up to these things that is pretty exciting. And I'm going to be honest with you, like, even though I have no intention of bidding on them, if you're in the room with these things, like, you've got a vested interest in the outcome. It's cool.
Yeah.
Oh, and I should also say, a lot of times the bidders are in the room, but sometimes the bidders are on the phone. And so there's like a whole bank of bid receivers who are, kind of running interference between the auctioneer up on the stage and the bidders who might be, or their agent who might be phoning in a bid. So it's a whole thing.
Wow. Okay. I get it. I can see it in my mind's eye. I'm imagining like some big, like shiny belt buckles and like really nice, like cowboy boots. Am I getting close?
Yeah, you're getting close. There's a lot of big hats and big hair.
Okay. Say no more. Now let's compare this to how the raffle system for these tags work, because this, and we'll get into the details of how these are kind of up and coming in a second, but just explain the mechanics of the raffle system and how it works.
You bet. So a raffle system would be familiar to anybody who has sort of, been in a small town and bought like a gun a day for the local hockey team or the baseball team. So it's a way of raising money through smaller increments at a time. And so a raffle basically is, it's a lottery. It's a random draw for a single tag. But the way you raise money on that and generate funds is it's sort of a low threshold of entry. So a lot of times it might be $20 to buy a raffle ticket. Maybe it's $50, but the idea is you will raise an expected amount of revenue through small increments for each ticket sold. And a lot of times there's no higher limit on the number of tickets that are sold. So it can be kind of interesting if you look at kind of the accounting and the numerology of raffles. But that's the idea. Everybody's got exactly the same chance. If you buy one ticket or 100, it's the same chance that your ticket will be drawn for everybody. And I should say, it's not so much a moment of time when this, like, as opposed to the auction tag, when everybody's convening on this one moment. Raffle tags have a long tail. They've got a long burn. Sometimes it takes a couple of months to sell a raffle. And so there's no real there. It's just sort of being done over time and kind of a slow, beneath kind of a lot of public scrutiny.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's like it's a little bit, it's kind of small towny in that way.
Yeah, and the key there is they just need volume. Like you need a lot of people to participate, or at least a lot of raffle purchases because at the end of the day, the state is trying to make as much revenue from this tag as possible because, well, explain like what the state is trying to do with these funds. Like what do they do with the money that is earned from these either raffles or auctions?
Yeah. So the funding sort of outcome is really the same in both cases. You've got the money flows to a state agency that is earmarked for a specific management purpose. And I think that's really key to understand is what's being brokered, what's being sold is an opportunity to hunt an animal, but that animal is the product of intensive management by the state agency. And so the idea for this is all of that money flows back into things that are going to benefit that particular species. So it might be GPS collars to put on mule deer to better understand migration patterns, or it might be extra funding that's going to go into improving habitat or winter range purchase, real estate purchase. So something like that. So that money all goes back to the same thing, regardless if the money is derived from an auction or a raffle.
Okay.
You mentioned BHA. So we just did this story in Montana, the backcountry hunters and anglers convinced, or they lobbied the state to change the mechanism for distributing this statewide mule deer tag from what had traditionally been done, which was an auction tag, to a raffle tag this year. And there was just a lot. It was an interesting sort of case study in the dynamics between these two models. What happened with this is backcountry hunters and anglers raised, I got the number here, $56,620, which was significantly more than the previous auction tag record, which was $41,000. So we're talking, $15,000 more was raised through that raffle tag model than through that auction tag model.
Yeah, nice.
And it was kind of interesting to actually drill down a little bit. They sold almost 3,000 tickets to about 1,500 buyers. So on average, each buyer bought 2 tickets for $20 a pop. So they raised, a pretty fair chunk of change with that.
Yeah. And we're seeing, like Montana's not the only one, right? Like other states are also considering switching from the auction tag model to this raffle model, right?
Yeah. Arizona really made headlines in March when their Fish and Wildlife Commission said, let's look at alternatives to the auction tag model. And I'm eager to talk about kind of the underlying sort of reasons for that change. But Arizona was really, I think, the highest profile sort of state to do this, largely because they have really relied on the revenue from these auction tags for a number of years, and it's been really successful. So for them to want to change direction for something that's worked pretty well as a revenue generator, I think it's a really interesting sort of moment in time.
Why would a state like Arizona, which has had success in selling these auction tags for, increasingly high numbers, like why would they switch?
So this really gets at kind of the bright line between these two models. They switched or are considering switching by 2026 because there's a real growing unease among some members of the hunting community that auction tags are really not in line with our North American model of wildlife conservation. If you think about some of the underlying pillars of that management philosophy, it is that wildlife is owned by all, it's owned by the public, and that it's important that there be equal opportunity to access public wildlife. So this is where we get the idea of sort of the democratization of wildlife. Everybody's got the same chance to draw a special tag, whether you're a school teacher or a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And the auction tag model has really turned that on its ear. I mean, we are literally selling these animals to the highest bidder. That's not in line with that North American model of the public trust of wildlife and the democracy of wildlife. And so a number of states, and this was really a strong current through the Arizona discussion, is to say, if we really believe in the democratization of wildlife, then we need to respect that through distributing it democratically. And a raffle is much more democratic than an auction.
Yeah. So let's stick with Arizona for a second, because just like digging into the numbers a little bit. Last year, you wrote this story, actually. They sold their statewide mule deer tag for $725,000, which is a record. Now, let's just say, like, for the sake of argument, this is not what they're going to do, but let's just talk this out. So we have some theoretical math going. Mm-hmm. If they were going to try to make up that money through a raffle system, selling $20 raffle tickets, they would have to sell 36,250 tickets, which is that's a lot. But even if they did, if you or I were to enter this raffle, because now we can, and we're going to buy one ticket, our chance of winning that tag is 1 in 36,250. So the folks who are going to buy into this raffle, one, they have to be very hopeful that they're lucky. And two, they also kind of have to believe, they just have to believe in the system and the value that they're spending their $20 or $40 on something that's going to help conservation and maybe help the everyday hunter, have a once in a lifetime opportunity, right? Like they have to really be, hopeful believers. Like that's what the state would have to count on.
Yeah. That's a lot of tickets to be sold. And when you actually start to look at kind of some of the alternatives to a raffle model of that, trying to raise that amount of revenue, that actually doesn't compete with the regular statewide lottery for a special permit, right? Which is, you've got better chances of drawing, a special tag for the Kaibab or the Arizona Strip in Arizona than you do for this raffle tag for a statewide, the statewide tag. And so in some ways, it just doesn't really compete with sort of the status quo. So this is a really important point of distinction. If you're trying to raise a really Herculean amount of money, raffles are probably not the right mechanism to do that. What's interesting about that Montana example is that $56,000 that was raised through raffle versus the $41,000 that was raised through auction, I think is an interesting sort of strata of revenue to look at. It's not nearly as much as this $725,000, obviously, and at that lower level, maybe raffles are a better, I'm not going to say better or worse, but a valid alternative to auction tags. As you get up into these higher levels, I just don't think that raffle tags can match the revenue generating potential of auction tags. And what's important going back to Arizona is that $725,000, every penny of that was put back into mule deer management in Arizona. That's one of the requirements of the Arizona mechanism, is that there's no administration fee that's taken off the top. Every bit of that dollar amount goes into the resource. And in Arizona, that means buying GPS collars that are being put on deer to help better understand the dynamics of migration patterns. It's building water guzzlers in arid landscapes to benefit native wildlife species, including mule deer. So, there's a lot of sort of good, valid management that's being done on the ground with this money.
We'll be right back after the break. Not to kind of choose sides here for which is better, but one place where it seems like auction tags are very important is in the sheep hunting and sheep conservation world, right? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. I call this the sheep exception, because if you think about kind of what we talked about sort of the whole idea of this extra revenue generation for rare species that are really expensive to manage. They're rare enough that there's not that many hunting opportunities, so states are not selling a lot of licenses for them. Think about like the alternative of the millions of deer tags that are being sold in the Midwest to manage deer in the Midwest. Like that's a self-perpetuating funding and benefit cycle that really doesn't exist for sheep hunting, because there's just so few tags. You can't really rely on licenses to generate revenue, and the management expenses for sheep are crazy. I mean, crazy high. In a lot of cases, you're talking about restoring sheep to vacant habitat, which requires, hiring contractors with helicopters to net gun sheep, basically capture sheep where they exist, put radio collars on them to do this crazy amount of disease monitoring and protocol. In some cases, it means you're having to buy out domestic sheep grazing allotments on public land in order to so that there's not competition between domestic and wild sheep and the disease vector that can be created between those two. Sheep management is just wildly expensive, and the resource itself doesn't pay for that. And so the auction tag model is actually really smart and I think really effective when it comes to sheep. And here's where I guess I would ask you to remember Reaganomics.
Oh boy,
I don't know how many listeners will remember trickle down economics, but the idea, from a macroeconomic standpoint, it's called supply side economics. And the idea being, hey, give tax breaks to big corporations, give tax breaks to wealthy investors. If we allow the top 10%, let's say, to exercise their full economic potential, they're going to create enough economic activity that's going to trickle down to employees, and there's going to be increasing manufacturing opportunities and markets. And so the idea is, let's let those investors really dictate what happens with the economy. It's really pretty similar on what I would call sheeponomics here. So let's sell a bunch of very exclusive and high-priced auction tags to sort of supercharge the management so that we have more sheep on the mountain, so that there are more hunting opportunities for the rest of us to be able to apply for. And what's actually pretty interesting in the sheep world is that's actually worked pretty well. We have more sheep hunting opportunities now than we've ever had. And I would say, you could argue the point, but I would say largely because there's been active sheep management that's been funded by these auction tags. And so while we may hold our nose sometimes at the violation of our North American model, the reality is it's raised the sea level for anybody who wants to be a sheep hunter.
Yeah, because realistically, if you're not a wealthy person who's going to be able to buy one of these tags or to be able to buy a guided hunt, you have to go in through, the standard state application process and, get a lot of preference points. And over time, hope that your name gets drawn when you're like 60 years old and you're still in good enough shape to do it. But the more of those tags that are available to the public, maybe the better chance you have of someday realizing that dream, right?
Yeah. It's funny when we talk about like the mechanics of it, it sounds like a deal with the devil. But what I would actually say is, especially in the world of sheep hunting, like sheep hunting has become the domain of the exclusive. And it's been trending that way for a long time. And it kind of breaks my heart because I feel like I am a sheep hunter in my bones who will never get a chance to be to exercise that.
You're
like
a sheep hunter who can't.
Yeah,
you're a sheep hunter who can't afford to go sheep hunting.
Yeah, and so I would say within that this kind of perverse world of sheep hunting, it is transactional and has been transactional for a long time. People who can afford to just buy sheep tags are sheep hunters, and they do it because they can. And because it's so transactional anyway, I feel like that creates some allowance for just perpetuating that with the auction tags. Okay, if it's going to be transactional anyway, at least the auction tags have a downstream public benefit by putting more sheep on the mountain for the rest of us to someday hunt. And I know that sounds like a downbeat sort of excuse for it, but I think it's real.
Yeah, and if it is working, and there are positive sheep recovery efforts that are being funded by these dollars, what's the alternative? That North American sheep slowly go extinct or slowly become so reduced in population that nobody can hunt them? Like I would rather not have that reality. So yeah, maybe deal with the devil sounds a little harsh, but if that means more sheep on the landscape and more opportunity to hunt them for everyone, then I guess that's okay. Let's do the deal.
Yeah, let's do the deal. And I think it's actually worked really well. At the sheep show in Reno in January, and they set records for their auction tags. There is a demonstrated market for it. And the Foundation for Wild Sheep has done a really good job of being honest brokers with the state agencies and promoting really meaningful management that the state agencies need and that the resource needs.
Yeah. not to get too far down the rabbit hole with the deal with the devil part, but I think there is one thing that we do have to talk about in regards to these auction tags is there is an industry, not just talking about sheep tags, but just these high dollar trophy tags, these very rare kind of coveted trophy tags. There is an industry around them. Like I've heard outfitters talking about this, and they'll essentially, scout an area and have, the one prime animal, the one biggest bull in the unit, and they'll have photos of them, and, we'll kind of shop that out there and be like, hey, this bull is going to go, he's going to be a potential state record. So if anyone's like looking to buy the statewide tag this year, this would be the time to do it. That, I'm guessing, doesn't sit too well with you as a defender of the North American model.
You would be correct. I think this is the most problematic part of the whole auction tag model.
Yeah.
And I think where the example that you just raised is exhibited, I think it should be called out at every time, because in some cases, and I would not say in most cases, but in many cases, the buyer of these auction tags is not buying a chance at a hunting opportunity, which is really the way that I think all of us approach hunting seasons when we go buy our deer tag or we put in for special draws for limited entry permits. Like, we're not doing it because there's a specific animal that we want to hunt, although maybe we've seen one on a trail cam, but that's not, we don't have an expectation, or we will not, we don't have an expectation that that's going to be the animal that we necessarily kill. But that is an expectation in some of these trophy tags.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm going deer hunting regardless of how small the bucks are on my trail cameras, because I just love deer hunting. That's not what's happening here.
No, in a lot of cases, and in some, many, most, who knows, those participants in the auction are buying an opportunity to hunt a specific animal. And in some cases, I would say they are buying it with the expectation that they will kill that animal. And that transactional part of it, I think, is really problematic, because like, if you pull that thread just a little bit, what we're doing is promoting market hunting.
Yeah.
Which is the very reason we have our North American model of wildlife conservation and the democratization of wildlife, was to get away from this sort of idea that you can exclusively own and sell an animal. Yeah. And I think any time that the auction approaches that, we should recognize it and call that out.
Yeah. Yeah. You see it with so many different aspects of hunting, but when the size of the trophy and the dollar amount gets to a certain point, then it's like a lot of the things that we sort of hold near and dear of like hunting ethics and like hunting tradition sort of get put on the side. And I think that's probably the danger with these auction tags. And that's probably what has inspired some of the energy around these raffles, I'm guessing.
Yeah. What's interesting is while the NGOs, the third party brokers of these, have created a real business, they've really entered the arena. Actually, state agencies have been doing this for some time. In Montana, we've got what's called the super tag. The state actually gives or sells raffles that $5 a piece for the marquee sort of trophy species. I think that's pretty cool. So like, the state is also recognized, like, hey, we need to raise revenue for these things. We're going to enter this ourselves. And so that the third party raffle tag sort of brokerage, I actually am a big proponent of it, largely because I do think it sort of is it's in the wavelength and in sort of the galaxy of the way we manage wildlife anyway. And frankly, I love looking at the results of those super tags and just seeing the wide variety of people. I rarely know them, but sometimes I do. I'm like, hey, the guy who sells cars, a couple of towns away just got the moose tag. That's cool.
Right. Right.
And it's a little vicarious in the way that I can see myself in that person's position. I don't see myself in the position of Jimmy John's, the sandwich czar, who buys the bighorn sheep tag for $500,000. Right. I just don't see myself in that.
Right. and has maybe been waiting to get news from that unit that this year there's going to be the biggest ram in the last decade available, versus the total opposite of the guy who just bought a $20 raffle and had no idea he had no expectation to win, and just all of a sudden was like, what? I won what? I get to do what? It's polar opposite.
Yeah.
Okay. I think this is my last question for you. If you got to run all of these, if you got put in charge of, these special tags, how would you do it? How would you pick which ones would work through a raffle and which ones would work through an auction? What do you think is the fairest way? One, for hunters, but two, to support the resource, because as you said before, this is like really valuable funding that states and the wildlife need to, keep populations going.
Oh man. It's the essential question. It's a good one. But it's hard because I do think there are values for both of them.
Yeah.
I do actually want to get into a couple of like third alternatives that I don't think have been really exercised. But the fundamental problem here is actually we don't pay enough for our hunting licenses to pay for all the management requirements. And what's interesting, I worked for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks here in Montana when we went through a license fee increase. The amount of pushback from resident hunters on license fee increases was significant. As much as we want the benefits of the revenue, we don't necessarily want to pay for it ourselves. And I think I think we got to look ourselves in the mirror and say, if these extra funding mechanisms are so odious, then maybe we need to step up to the plate and do a better job ourselves. So I think that's sort of the operating climate. But I do think there's something rotten about auction tags. I really do. I don't think they're in line with our kind of stated standards of wildlife management in America. One person told me in defense of auction tags, we hold our nose when we do it, but we still do it because we see the outcome. Well, the fact that we're holding our noses, I think that should tell us something. There's something that we really don't like about it. And so I think we need to acknowledge that and minimize the more odious parts of it. Like you said, the more transactional parts. Are we buying an actual individual animal when we're doing this, or the chance, an opportunity to hunt an animal? But as we talked about with sort of the revenue hierarchy, the more money we hope to make, the more the auction tag model makes sense. There are people with the resources and the means to buy these. And as long as there are very transparent mechanisms that show the public benefit to these auction tags, that there's going to be more public hunting opportunities as a result, I can support them. And I think they remain an important tool. But, I'm a middle of the roader, as you know. I do think there's an important place for raffles. And I think backcountry hunters and anglers test case is a really important one to look at, that they can raise more money than the auction model up to a certain revenue point. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at. What is that floor and what is that ceiling? And I'm going to stick my neck out and say it may be, in the current economy, 80 to 100,000. If that's what you're hoping to raise, I think you can, with a good effort, I think you can raise the same amount in a raffle that you can in an auction. And so then I think it becomes kind of a choice among the constituency of a certain state of which you are more comfortable with. I think if you're trying to raise more than $100,000, I think the auction tag model is really the way to go.
Yeah.
But I promised you a third way, right?
Yeah.
I actually think there's other ways of raising money for wildlife. Some states do it with the super tag raffles that are being done. Maybe you do it with $25 tags instead of $5 tags. But maybe there's a way. I'm really going out on a limb here, but if you are Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, to say, or the Foundation for Wild Sheep, maybe the chapter in Pittsburgh, Kansas, I'm just going to throw out a place, commits to, like, all the revenue at that banquet goes to bighorn sheep management in the Rock Creek area of western Montana. I think there are actually ways that we can sort of supercharge what we've done with funding, third-party funding for wildlife conservation, and really focus it on specific species and specific areas where conservation and management has real need. Maybe there's other things that are not monetary to benefit a species. Maybe you volunteer for habitat improvements, or you help put in guzzlers in arid environments. And when you do that, you win a chance at a super tag raffle. So kind of the sweat equity part of it, where maybe it's not just money that benefits these management things. Maybe it's in-kind donations or help. And I think there's a lot of work that we could do there. If the real need is habitat management, let's look at alternatives to money.
Yeah.
And I think if we open our minds a little bit, maybe we can get away from this revenue model altogether.
Man, that's an interesting idea. Volunteering on habitat projects as a way to get an opportunity to be drawn in a sheep hunt. I like that. I would do that.
I would do that.
Yeah, we have a lot better chance in that drawing than going up against Jimmy John in the auction. So.
And I think it's highly democratic, right? It's the amount you put in is sort of what you get out of it, in that anticipation that I could get drawn to go hunt the place I just helped improve. Like, I think it's a real organic sort of link between beneficiaries and outcome.
Yeah, I like it. Okay. Well, hey, some state agency, please do this, and I'll come volunteer and maybe get a chance to win one of these super tags, because that's a good idea. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, that was a fun talk.
The Outdoor Life podcast is edited by Mike Pedersen of 85 Audio. It's hosted by our editor-in-chief, Alex Robinson. It's produced by me, executive editor Natalie Krebs. You can read more of Andrew McKean's reporting on raffle tags at outdoorlife.com/raffletag. Music in this episode is composed and performed by Pierre Locatelli via APM Music.